Hey everybody, it's Debbie Potts doing a new episode of the Low Carb Athlete. Once again, talking about how we can build our health from the inside out so we can burn fat, optimize our health, immune system, and improve our performance, athletic performance, as well as performance in daily life. So I'm so excited to team up with NutriSense and talk about how it works, what it is, how it works after that, and then all these different questions I've come up with as I've experimented with it the last 2 weeks. So we have Cara from NutriSense to share all this information with us, and I'm sure we're going to need two parts. So thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So talk about what your role is and let's talk about what NutriSense is and what your role is with the company.
Yeah, so NutriSense, we are a metabolic health company with the goal of optimizing your health, preventing chronic conditions, or addressing any problems that might be happening in your metabolic health. So how we accomplish that is we utilize continuous glucose monitoring technology. So for those who have never heard of a CGM before, Debbie's got one on the back of her arm. They're these little devices and you stick it on the back of your arm, and as she knows, it's really painless. It's super easy. It may be scary at first to put it on, but it's very easy. If you've ever checked your glucose at home with a glucose meter, much easier than that. And that little patch stays on the back of your arm for 14 days. Yeah. And so then for 14 days straight, you get 24/7 glucose data. And so the second component of our service is our app. So you scan the device on the back of your arm with our app, and then you can see your glucose data. And then you can track what you're eating on top of that and your exercise on top of that, stress, sleep, all these other factors that affect our glucose and our metabolic health. You can track and analyze and see what's really going on inside of you.
Yeah, that's what's so easy. It's just crazy how just done, uploaded. Yep. But we did a video you can find on the YouTube channel on how to install it, because I was actually scared and waited a week. I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this. My husband didn't want to shove it in my arm either. And then we did it on the video. I'm like, that was it. I didn't feel actually anything. So
yeah, it's so easy. I describe it literally as an easy button because it's in this little inserter and you put it in the back of your arm, you just tap the button and it's just that easy and it's right there. And there's a little needle during insertion, but it's just there to place the device. It doesn't stay in your arm. Mm-hmm. So it's very painless. You can, exercise, shower, do all your normal activities with the device on, and it should be perfectly fine.
Well, I have my other Band-Aid I need to put on it. So this is what the Band-Aid looks like, and kind of like a donut hole. And mm-hmm. I need to replace mine, but I was afraid to take it off.
Yeah. Yeah, we include the bandages to go over top in case you're somebody who's working out a lot or sweating a lot or maybe going in the sauna, just to make sure it doesn't fall off, because we want to make sure you get 14 full days of data. So the third component that we offer is a live dietitian to help you interpret the information. Yeah. So I've been chatting with Debbie through the app, but every new customer gets a dietitian to talk through the app. And they're there not to put you on a specific diet or, tell you exactly what to do, but they're there to help you become a glucose expert and to know all the ins and outs of what's happening with your data and your body. And then from there, they can suggest changes on how to optimize those values or things to look for, maybe other things to check for. But they're there really to meet you where you're at, personalize the information, and help build you to the best version of yourself. So that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, I'm a dietitian and I lead the nutrition program. So I'm the director of nutrition at NutriSense. And this has really been like my passion for so long. So I started my career in the hospital system, mostly working in ICUs, and saw, the sickest of the sick. A lot of people coming in with suffering and complications of lifestyle related chronic conditions. And I was just very frustrated with that experience. And I realized we can do something about these issues. We don't have to have all these horrible complications of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and dementia. So my goal was really to address the root cause, which I believe is metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, and using tools and technology to personalize that information so that it's meaningful to the person. It's much easier to stick to a behavior change if the data actually came from your own body rather than, something you heard online. So it's much more meaningful, and we're addressing things early and the real root cause. So that's a long-winded explanation of what we're trying to do, but you know, you've found a lot of information from the device, and we're really targeting people who are not necessarily diabetic, because we believe this data can be insightful for everybody, not just somebody who has diabetes.
Preventive.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an amazing story, because so many dietitians are trained the old school way, and you know, we're still going by the food pyramid, and you know, fat's bad for you. So it's really, you were thinking outside the box and being a leader in your own industry to think, okay, this isn't working. It's like doctors that go into functional medicine and different people, like Dr. Sarah Gottfried, or who I was thinking of, gosh, just went blank. Saturated fats. What's your name? Who just wrote a new book. Anyway, so it's just all these different doctors that I love to hear about that. They're like, okay, what I'm doing, what I was taught in school isn't working. What else can I do and be effective? And really looking at different triggers. And so like Dr. Ben Bickman talks a lot, his research on insulin resistance, and that insulin is also saying the root of a lot of our metabolic disorders. And what we can do now is biohack, or, you know, really learn individually how our blood sugar is changing throughout the day. And what I've been really curious about nighttime. And so let's talk about the role of blood sugar testing 24 hours a day versus just pricking your finger. You know, I love Keto Mojo and what they're doing, but and other companies, but it is really a treat to be able to see what's going on all the time at nighttime, because I don't ever test my blood sugar middle of the night. So this is just such a more simple way to really see the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So when people ask me, why should a non-diabetic be measuring their glucose 24/7? The number one reason, and I have multiple reasons, but the number one is that continuous data gives you insights that you wouldn't normally be able to know. So there's no other way to know exactly what's happening while you're sleeping. I don't recommend waking up in the middle of the night and checking your glucose with a glucose meter, right? We don't want to interrupt sleep. So the only way to really see that is using a CGM. You can wake up in the morning, scan, and see the whole night. The other advantage of continuous data is getting to see the really true exact shape of your glucose curve after you eat something. So this tells us a lot about your metabolic health and how you respond to different foods and what might work better for you or not as good for you. And it's very hard to catch the exact shape of that postprandial curve on a glucose meter. I always give the example of, before I started wearing CGMs, I did check my finger glucose all the time. And I tried a bunch of different fruits just to see which ones might work better for me. And I tried pineapple, which is very high glycemic. And so I expected a high glucose response. And I checked my glucose 30 minutes after and 2 hours after, and both of those completely normal values. But then when I check it with a CGM, I'm actually spiking really high in the first like 10 minutes, but coming back down really quickly. Totally missed that on a glucose meter. I had no idea that it was actually giving me the highest glucose spike out of any of the other fruits I had tried. So you just miss that information because you don't know when you're going to have your highest glucose value after a meal. You might catch it on the glucose meter, you might not. And we also want to see, how high does your glucose go? But we also want to know, how long did it take to get back down to normal? Did you have some reactive hypoglycemia after a meal? Did you spike but then dip, and that's an energy crash? Or did you have, you know, some weird responses after a meal? It's just hard to find that on a glucose meter. So that is the biggest advantage to the continuous data, is you know exactly how you respond to a food. You can pinpoint which meals, combination of meals, which individual ingredients work best for you, what's happening while you're sleeping. Then you can also measure things like standard deviation that give you a proxy for your glycemic variability. So glycemic variability is just the swings in your glucose. So how high you're going up, how high you're going down, how far you are from your average. And this is an independent predictor of cardiovascular disease specifically, but also a whole host of other chronic conditions. And so this metric is uniquely predictive of these outcomes. But you can't measure those swings unless you have 24/7 data. So you also get a good idea of where do I lie on the standard deviation and this glycemic variability metric. So it's really one of the only devices where you can see this type of information.
Maybe I should explain why that is not a good thing. You know, why is it bad to have your blood sugar go up too high, and what is too high and what is too much variance? But you know, what are the complications if we continue, if we're doing this every day, as most people probably are, because you don't know what you don't know if you don't test and you're just guessing.
Exactly.
But you know, what happens if we don't do something about this fluctuations?
Yeah, great question. And so if we're breaking it down into, okay, what are optimal glucose values and then what are the consequences if they're outside of that range? The first trend we're looking at is your fasting glucose value. So this might be what your glucose looks like in the morning, what it looks like while you're sleeping. As long as you didn't eat right before you went to bed, then it's not quite really a fasted value. But this we want mostly between 70 and 90. It's normal to have some fluctuation while we're sleeping and fasting, which a lot of people don't realize. Your liver is regulating your glucose. Sometimes it's bringing it up a little, sometimes it's bringing it down a little. So it's okay to have some variation. But when we consistently have a fasting glucose value over 90, that is an independent risk factor for developing things like insulin resistance, diabetes, cardiovascular disease down the road. So that's the first metric. But I would say the most important metrics are the second two: how high your glucose is going and those swings in your data. So how high it goes, in general, for a non-diabetic, for optimal outcomes, we want to stay below 140 milligrams per deciliter most of the time. So there is a lot of research that when we start crossing that 140 threshold, we start to reduce our body's insulin sensitivity. We start to impair the beta cell function in our pancreas, and we start to overload the mitochondria. So if you think about the mitochondria, they are having to process all this energy, right? So when you have a big glucose load come in, the mitochondria has to deal with all of that and convert it into energy. So I like to describe it as it's like, you know, our body is an engine, a car. And when we have a big glucose load, even though we can process it and handle it okay, it's like putting the gas pedal all the way down. So you're revving up the engine. And if we do that every once in a while, it's going to be okay. But if multiple times a day, we're putting that gas pedal all the way down, we're going to burn out our engine. We're going to create fumes and toxins that come out. We're going to create these oxygen species, reactive oxygen species, oxidative damage by putting the mitochondria in overdrive to have to deal with this glucose load. So all of these things happen. So if we have repeated exposure of glucose above 140, it's like we're running on 100 all of the time. And we don't want our body to always have that gas pedal all the way down. And these glucose spikes are also damaging our endothelial cells. So if you think about it, the glucose is in our blood, right? We always have some blood sugar. And if that blood sugar goes too high, it is touching the blood vessels, and then that is damaging to those blood vessels. It's called glucotoxicity. So too much glucose in the blood at one time can hurt the endothelial cells and increase our risk factors for cardiovascular disease and inflammation, because then a bunch of cytokines have to come in and clean up that damage to the endothelial cells, which causes inflammation. So again, it's about repeated abuse. We do that every once in a while. Every once in a while you have a treat or something, your body can repair that. It's, you know, it's okay. We're not going to break apart if you have one spike every once in a while. But if we're having a spike above 140 every day, every morning for breakfast, you know, you didn't realize that your whole wheat bagel is spiking your glucose, then that's when we start to see accumulated damage. So that's really that peak glucose value. And then that third metric is what we talked about with glucose swings. So your glycemic variability. And this is a leading indicator specifically for cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance. As we talked about, those swings are really damaging to our vasculature system. And so we want to avoid major shifts in glucose. So maybe you stayed below that 140, but your glucose went from 60 to 130 when you ate something. That's a big shift in glucose. So that's a third metric we want to keep in mind when we're looking at this data.
Great analogy. I think the car analogy always works good for so much of our body functions. So how does, metabolic flexibility come into play here? Is that, we always for 10 years talked about being fat adapted and metabolically efficient so you can, be metabolically flexible to burn fat, but then when you have to go burn carbs as an athlete, or you're at a higher intensity exercise, or you eat too many carbs, as you said, in a treat that people overindulge, and then they're still able to switch back. So how does this kind of cross over and information we can get from the NutriSense continuous glucose monitoring?
Good question. And I really believe that metabolic flexibility is the goal that we should all be aiming for. So coming back to the car analogy, somebody who's metabolically flexible, I like to describe it as a hybrid car. Mm-hmm. So we could run on maybe, low energy all day long, but if we need to go up to the highway or really quick speed up, you can run on gasoline. So it's like switching from fat to glucose. We have the option to have the appropriate fuel depending on the situation. And that's really the goal. We want our bodies to be able to match whatever the situation is with the right fuel availability. But unfortunately, many people are not metabolically flexible. And that is really always associated with metabolic disorders, like anything that's related to insulin resistance and connected to that. There's always metabolic inflexibility present. And so to be able to see this in your data, you can test it in multiple ways. Most people, the general population, are metabolically inflexible to using fats, right? Most people are using glucose as their primary fuel source all of the time. And so you could see things like, when you're fasting, are you getting really hungry after a couple hours? Are you getting hypoglycemic after a couple hours? You can see like putting your system in that test of should be able to burn fat in this moment. Are you able to? You can also see the opposite, because I see in some of the very low carb world, we have the opposite problem where we've been so low carb, so zero carb for so long that now our body's like, I'm really running on fat, but they become metabolically inflexible to glucose. And I see this problem where, maybe somebody's doing a strict ketogenic diet they've been doing it for multiple years, and then it's their birthday and they have a bunch of treats and their glucose goes to 250 for 4 hours because the body doesn't know how to process glucose anymore. So you could see something like you can do a glucose tolerance test at home, just have a bunch of, carb foods just to see how your body can process it. If we're metabolically flexible, we should be able to run off of fat, fast perfectly fine, but we should also be able to have carbohydrates and not have a massive glucose spike, because that shows we're not able to process carbohydrates as well either. So you can see maybe, where am I lacking? Is it more on the fat side or is it more on the carbohydrate side? And then from there, we can work on addressing that. And sometimes, that might be if you're so fat adapted that your body no longer knows how to process carbohydrates, maybe that's every once in a while including some carbohydrates after a workout when you're really insulin sensitive. Or maybe that is, doing more strength training where we're increasing our insulin sensitivity. There's different tricks we can do to improve metabolic flexibility. But yes, that's a huge component of metabolic health, is being able to switch back and forth when it is appropriate.
Well, I'm writing down so many notes here. Let's see. When people are using the NutriSense, can you see when they're a carb burner versus a fat burner, because their blood sugar levels are always elevated? Is that indication that they're more of a sugar burner than a fat burner?
We can't say with definitive, like 100%, I know what's going on, but it's a correlate and it's a good proxy. You can certainly see if somebody isn't able to burn glucose as much anymore. If they're such in fat burning that they no longer can tolerate glucose, that's easy to see because you try some carbohydrates and it does not go so well, right? it's not perfectly correlated with the opposite, where maybe you're always burning glucose. How do we know for sure that you're running off of fat? That's why we also have the ability to add in other metrics into our app. Like you can add your ketones that you might be measuring, and it can show up on the graph with your glucose. If we can see that ratio of glucose to ketones, that provides a lot more information. But a lot of times people who are not fat adapted at all, you know, when we try to do more fasting, more time restricted eating, we might see a drop in glucose where, you know, their body is thinking, I don't have any energy, and it's getting hypoglycemic, even though you should be able to tap into those fat stores. So that could be a sign that you're not utilizing the fat availability very well, and your body thinks there's no energy, and you're feeling shaky, and you're feeling the symptoms of hypoglycemia because your body thinks there's no energy. That might be a sign.
Interesting. So the other question is, well, follow my list. So, cause I've keep having more, the effects of your blood sugar and food sensitivities. Are you able to sense that? If I know we do the Cocoa Pulse test in nutritional therapy, if your pulse goes up 5 beats after you have a specific food, you can even put it on your tongue. If that raises your pulse, that's a reactive food, most likely. Does that occur with your blood sugar? If I had tacos, corn tortillas one day, just a little mini taco, and my blood sugar went really high, and then the next day we had tacos leftovers, and I just put it on a lettuce wrap, and my blood sugar was steady. So does that mean, you know, the corn tortilla, I looked it up, only had 15 grams of carbs, and it was homemade. Is that food sensitivity, or is that just the carbohydrates? So that was just an example, but do you find any correlation with food sensitivities, or have you looked at that?
Yeah, specifically with food sensitivities, this is an area that hasn't been researched very well in correlation to glucose. If any researchers are listening to this, it would be very interesting. There's some mice studies where they're showing that not a food allergy, which is different, but a food sensitivity reaction can reduce insulin sensitivity in the muscles and increase glucose, especially because of the inflammation present. But I haven't seen any human studies on this at this time. And from the data we see of people, just our observational clinical experience, it seems that sometimes we see a definite connection, and then sometimes we don't. So I don't know if it's always perfectly correlated. Some people will know they have an intolerance to something and they'll eat it, and we don't see it in their glucose. But other people, like I had somebody recently who was eating macadamia nuts and having a glucose spike. And we were like, that's unusual because it's just fat and some protein. And then they did a food sensitivity test, and macadamia nuts was the highest one. So it can be a signal for some people, but I certainly can't say that it's a perfect correlation by any means.
Okay. So I'll nominate myself to be investigator, because as an FDN practitioner, and as what I do for a living, health coaching now, is combine my nutritional therapy training as practitioner and FDN practitioner, where we do lab testing, and part of that's hormones, food sensitivity tests, microbiome, and parasite, fungal infections, yeast infections, stuff like that. So putting all this data together and correlating that with the NutriSense results, as well as genetic reports as DNA Fit. And so I'm trying to get all this data together to really find out what a person needs to do individually to be, as you said, is what I said, be the best version of yourself. And if you want to optimize your health and performance and longevity, we need to collect all this information and figure out your why. And it's not one size fits all, it's so individual. So chronic stress impacts the whole you. And for years, and I wrote a book about stress, is that every stress response is a blood sugar response. So what type of stress that becomes a chronic stressor, if it's a food sensitivity test, or food that you're sensitive to, or if it's, you know, someone just yelled at you and you're stressed out, like our toilet is flooded the other day and leaked through the garage, and my blood sugar was higher the next day. I thought, okay, I'm really frustrated because we just had this ridiculous leak through the ceiling, and now I have all this extra stuff. So stress impacts your glucose. So do you see that in your readings at all? People had a horrible day, or, you know, it's because it's just stress as an external, but the hidden internal stressors all come out as interpreting by the brain stress.
Yes, absolutely. So stress is a big one, and this is 100% a leading factor in glucose control. So when we're talking about how do we optimize our glucose values, I usually talk about it as 4 key pillars, like 4 legs of a chair, and they're equally important. You can't take away one and hope that the chair stands up. And one of those is stress. And we can lump together, all the different stressors in there because they all have an effect. But if we talk about or think about traditional stress response, it's supposed to be an acute stress response. So you have a release of adrenaline, and then that stimulates a glucose increase. The body is either creating new glucose in the liver, or it's breaking down our storage form of glucose, glycogen. And then we also are reducing insulin sensitivity so that the body has that glucose available to use for energy to deal with the stressor at hand. So acute stress, somebody's in a traffic jam, somebody's fighting with their boss, fighting with their partner, we always see a glucose spike. And sometimes it's a rather large glucose response. And it might be somebody, somebody's following a low carb diet. That might be the highest glucose responses they ever see is from stressful moments. So that is acute stress, and you'll see an actual spike. But chronic stress, what, I'm sure you're well aware of and your audience is well aware of, is not what our body is designed to be under. It's not designed to be under chronic stress. And the number one reason for these elevated values while we're sleeping and when we're fasted is chronic stress, because we're always stimulating some cortisol and the liver is pumping out extra glucose to deal with this. And that's causing that fasting glucose value to rise. Because when we're fasted, the liver is what's maintaining our normal glucose values. So if we're stimulating glucose production from the liver because of cortisol, then it's going to keep rising even though we're not eating anything or eating any carbohydrates. So when somebody has a higher fasting glucose value, higher overnight glucose value, that's the first thing I'm going to ask about is, what is your stress like? Tell me about your day, walk me through what a normal day looks like. And that might be also stressors like poor sleep. That's very similar effect that psychological stress has. This is very, very well documented in the research, and we also see it clinically in everybody, is one bad night of sleep, whether it's interrupted sleep or just shortened sleep, is going to put you in a state of insulin resistance the next day. So the research compares it to literally diabetic levels of insulin resistance the day after a poor night of sleep. So you're going to have higher responses to food, higher overall baseline values. And we can correct that. It's temporary. If then you get a good night of sleep, your body can go back to normal. But if we have this cumulative poor night of sleep over and over, we work with a lot of physicians and nurses who work night shifts, or maybe new parents who have babies and they don't get a lot of sleep. And this is very apparent that sleep is a huge factor in our ability to maintain good glucose values. So I count that as, a major pillar in that stress column as well.
What I would add to that is also what we do as FDM. We talk about these external stressors, but the hidden internal stressors, which impact our hormones, our immune system, digestion, detoxification, immune system, and neurotransmitters, nervous system. So that's what, is important to have practitioners combine, I think, NutriSense with the functional lab testing as we use as FDN practitioners, which ones we choose depending on the client. But really assessing, as I said before, the whole picture of your external stressors. Let's talk about that. But we don't know about these hidden internal stressors are causing chronic stress, and probably what I've been curious about, impacting that glucose level, especially at nighttime. As I sent you these, I was going down rabbit holes, like, okay, well, there's, we always talk about this liver time, and between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. is when your liver's more active, processing, doing its internal housekeeping, detoxification phases in Chinese medicine. But it's, looking at, okay, is there a trend going on with people's blood sugar that has more stress, but maybe external stress is not that bad, but they have these hidden stressors that they don't know about pathogens, about mold toxicity, microbiome dysbiosis, microbiome imbalances, and how that impacts their glucose is what I've been totally geeking out about. But it's just curious if you've seen anything that been off of people at nighttime.
Yes, absolutely. And this is rather well documented as well, of this connection between our microbiome and glucose control. There's very interesting studies where they transfer the gut microbiome from a insulin resistant person to a lean individual, and insulin sensitivity changes dramatically in peripheral tissues and in the liver within, 24, 48 hours. So it's undeniable that this connection is here. And, the chicken or the egg, what came first? Did the dysbiosis drive the metabolic syndrome, or did metabolic syndrome drive the dysbiosis? It's probably a two-way street. We're probably seeing it going in both directions, but the connection is undeniable. That a healthy microbiome is very important for maintaining good glucose control and good metabolic health. And when we have dysbiosis, for whatever reason, whether that's a bunch of antibiotics, chronic stress, toxins, like you were talking about, mold, parasites, this is going to affect our metabolic health, and this is going to affect our glucose control. So I really appreciate that, you look at this big picture, and there's practitioners like yourself looking at this, because it's very important and it's so commonly missed in the traditional setting. And it might be, the thing that the person needs to focus on most, and somebody is, brushing it aside as just like GI distress or, psychological stress, putting you on an antidepressant. We see things like this. It's well documented, but ignored in the mainstream, that things like the chemical toxins, the mycotoxins, candida, all of these things are affecting not only the microbiome, but also our insulin production in the beta cells of our pancreas. They can damage those beta cells. Specific toxins have been shown to damage those cells, decrease our ability to produce insulin, block those insulin receptor sites, a whole host of downstream effects that are going to impact our metabolic health, unfortunately. So those things have to be addressed if that's a problem that's happening with the person.
I did I've done like a bunch of podcasts with Karan of Microbiome Labs, and we recorded one yesterday talking a little bit about their new lab test, Biome FX. And we didn't get to, this is one of my questions about insulin resistance in the microbiome, but I know they have lots of information, but the Microbiome FX is a great test to include into our investigation, working with people trying to build their health. But what I want to add in is what Karan and I were talking about yesterday, and it's the same thing what you're saying, and is what I try to do is help people figure out what is going on, what's missing, by investigating the whole picture, because all these people are similar to me, that I was doing all the right things. And you're like, hey, how come I'm doing low carb, I'm doing exercise, I'm doing the cold therapy, I'm doing HIIT training, I'm doing my sleep hacks, but I still am not losing weight, I'm still not feeling my optimal self? And that's when I think people need to dive in a little deeper and work with a health detective, health practitioner that will investigate all these labs and correlate that with the NutriSense. And that's what I'm recommending to my clients to do. It's like, all right, let's order these labs, but also get the NutriSense, because I can't really tell what's going on if we don't see this whole picture 24/7. As well as, I know you guys talk about doing an aura ring, if you really want to get into it, see, okay, what is going on, my quality of sleep, what's my heart rate variability? And for athletes, how's your recovery and repair? Are you overtraining or are you undertraining? And adding all that information. If people really want to optimize their health and improve their performance longevity, these are all these tools that you want to do, because you can't just monitor and just change what you're eating, but it's your lifestyle behaviors that are impacting your microbiome, impacting your gut-brain connection. So it's cool.
Absolutely. And it can be demoralizing for somebody who feels like they're doing all the right things and nothing's getting better, and people aren't taking them seriously. So that's something, our dietitians are really trained to think about as well, is this whole picture, because we have a lot of customers who are already very health conscious. They're already excited about glucose and they want this data. And a lot of them are in similar situations where they have, fatigue or something going on, bloating, weight, stall, something where it's like, I'm doing all the right things. Most of these people aren't eating standard American diet, but they're still not seeing success, or things are getting worse. And so we do absolutely, first it's like, okay, let's check the basics and make sure, sleep is good. Are you active? Are you moving throughout the day? But then if all of those are exactly where we want them to be, we have to look at these other factors. And the gut is certainly one of the first things you need to look at, because it can impact so much of our health.
Yeah. So another question kind of was thinking of the people in the group page on Facebook it's great questions to hear what everyone's experiences are. But for females, the hormone cycle, how is the blood sugar change? Because I know I've been trying to work on a blog, which is taking longer than I thought it would, on, we've talked before in the past about exercising and eating based on your time of the menstrual cycle for females. And how has your blood sugar changed during your cycle? Have you looked at that at all?
Yes, definitely. And there's a little bit of research on this, but not much. But then after seeing lots of people, the patterns become extremely apparent. Yep, the real research. And so for most women, and again, no one size fits all, which is why I really recommend people monitor this, data over dogma. Try it for 28 days, 2 sensors, and you can see how it changes with your cycle. But for most women, they're most likely see higher glucose values during the luteal phase. So between week 3 and 4, between ovulation and menstruation, when estrogen's a little lower and progesterone is peaking. And for most people, no matter what they're doing, we're seeing higher glucose values during this time. Just an average glucose that's, for some people, just maybe a couple points higher. And for some people, they see this effect more dramatically, and it can be 10, 15 points higher baseline for this week leading up to their period. So this is very common. And what seems to be happening is the progesterone is decreasing our insulin sensitivity, and it's also decreasing our glycogen turnover. So it's harder for us to utilize our stored carbohydrates. And then we're having these higher glucose values because of this decreased insulin sensitivity and poor ability to utilize carbohydrates. So this is very common, and it's not talked about that much. So I appreciate that you're a female host and you're asking these questions, but it seems like, a lot of people are skipping right over the fact that we're not the same people. Yeah. Women and men have different physiology, and women are going to experience more glucose fluctuations. Anytime we have hormonal changes, whether it's menstrual cycle, menopause, or whether, something else going on, thyroid issues, hormones are going to affect your glucose. It's just a given. And so whenever you expect something like a major hormonal shift, expect that that's going to have a downstream effect on things like glucose. So sometimes you figure out this pattern, you're like, I'm always higher glucose during this time. Can't control that, but we can control how we respond to that. So that might be a time where you're more meticulous about a lower carbohydrate diet, or, we might not tolerate treats or a carbohydrate meal as well. So I'm going to monitor that more closely. And then, you might be able to speak to this better, but there's difference in our ability to train in relation to hormone changes as well. So people tend to be able to metabolize carbohydrates, recover better, and put on muscle mass better, do more strength training in the follicular phase. I'm not sure if that's the experience you've had as well. And so many people, they'll be like, I feel so low energy doing my strength training at this time. My glucose is higher, and they feel like, they're like, what am I doing wrong? And again, it's demoralizing because they're not realizing it's hormone driven changes. It's not your fault, but we just have to acknowledge that and understand that, you're not doing anything wrong. It's just different at this time of month.
Well, that's why I think for female athletes and people that are low carb female athletes, and we've done a few podcasts on this, and Dr. Stacy Sims in her book Roar kind of touches on a lot of it without necessarily being low carb, promoting low carb, but she, started a lot of ideas for us, thinking, okay, you're more carb sensitive the first part of your cycle. So that's when you might want to do more HIIT training. That's why I was trying to put together in a chart. It's like week 1, all the different phases. What should you eat? What's your blood sugar levels, insulin sensitivity? And carb sensitivity, and then exercise, you're more matched to male hormones at the beginning of your cycle.
Exactly.
And right before your hormones are elevated, that's when you want to do lower carbohydrates because you're not sensitive, probably do more low heart rate training, more endurance training. I think I might have it right or wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what I've seen. So okay. Yeah.
I was trying to put that together because I have a few different articles, and I know with Keon, we've talked about it. Ben Greenfield's company, I do some coaching with Keon program, and we went over that, but I'm trying to make it into an easy to navigate chart with all the info together, because I think it is not talked about enough for females in general for health building, but also for the athletic female as well, to change how you're eating based on the time of the month, change how you train based on time of the month. So that's a big question. Okay, back to my list. I think we talked about a lot of stuff, but the last part is exercise, of course, our main topic of the show. Exercise and blood sugar. What have you learned, being fasted workouts in the morning, and what I've been trying to track with myself and reading people's posts is, because most people in the group seem to be low carb biohackers, but looking at low heart rate training, so maffetone, max aerobic function, I don't know if you're familiar with lower heart rate training, endurance, versus strength training, like a core workout, versus high intensity, high heart rate, low heart rate, versus yoga, and how my blood sugar is responding to that, especially in the morning, fasted, because I do most of my workouts fasted, and how the blood sugar is impacted by that. So what's your experience in your own little study, watching and reading from people?
And this is another good area where you can match, like, what should your glucose be doing in a certain type of physical activity, and then what is it actually doing? And this is a good way to match, am I potentially metabolically inflexible and my fuel response is not what we expect it to be? So you can kind of see where am I lying here? So in general, for lower intensity workouts, things like yoga, very low intensity, we expect very little or no change in glucose, potentially a slight dip just from movement. So things like even going on a walk, things like yoga, we might see a small glucose decrease as your body's just stimulating your muscles, moving and utilizing some of that circulating glucose. 80% of our circulating glucose ends up going to the skeletal muscle. So just by moving, and for people who want to lower their glucose values in general, I always tell them just going on a walk after you eat can make a big difference. It's really amazing how much of a difference it can make. So just by moving helps bring up some of this glucose. So low intensity, we might see a small decrease, especially if it's in a fed state, as your body's picking up that extra glucose. If we're in a fasted state, you might see, very minimal change as your liver is able to just maintain normal glucose levels during that time. So if you're doing low intensity and you're seeing a glucose spike, that might mean that you're not so metabolically flexible, or that, you might need to work on training a little bit if we're seeing a glucose increase to rather low intensity exercise. Same with longer workouts that are maybe still lower intensity, but something like, steady state cardio, we would expect a gradual decrease in glucose. Not going to bottom out, but, you might see a dip and then it kind of stays at a lower level. Because of this reason, the energy availability is enough to meet the energy demand. So the availability in your circulation is enough to meet the demand of the lower intensity endurance exercise. And so you can pick up that glucose and run off of that, and we wouldn't expect to see a glucose spike because what you have is enough to fuel the exercise. Whereas if you're doing something higher intensity, so maybe heavy strength training or a HIIT workout, sprints, maybe you're doing hill running, you would maybe expect to see a glucose spike in response to this. And that is because the energy demand of the exercise is higher than the current energy availability. And so the body is producing or releasing glucose to fuel that exercise. So it might be doing that by breaking down some of the glycogen stores, or if you're in a low glycogen state, you might create new glucose from the liver to fuel this exercise. So you could see a glucose spike all the way up to 160 during really high intensity exercise, and that's perfectly okay. It's not the same as a spike from food because the body is using that energy right away. It's producing it so that it can fuel this workout. And it's also not as insulin mediated glucose uptake because it's for exercise versus something coming from a meal. So I don't want people to be scared when they see a spike with a high intensity workout. It's completely normal. And that's just because it's a glycolytic type of activity. The body wants glucose for this burst of activity. And so it creates or releases glucose. You might see that spike, but then for the rest of the day, you should see lower glucose values. Any type of exercise, whether it's aerobic or strength training or HIIT, should improve our insulin sensitivity and lead to lower glucose values afterwards. It's one of the best things you can do to improve your insulin sensitivity is to exercise in whatever form you like to exercise. So while you might see a spike, you should see lower values the rest of the day. So that's sort of the general match of high, same, or low.
Yeah, I just was curious. I was looking at mine from this morning. I ran and it was kind of a run. It was lower heart rate, and then I had some big hills. So I was trying to do Wednesdays, trying to do hill repeats or hill intervals. But my blood sugar just stayed like up to 90 was my highest. But then when I was done, it went all the way down really low to 67, and then back up to 96. And I just had some coffee. But what is there anything like when you're running endurance that's like maybe you're burning more fat because your heart rate's or blood sugar is stable, so it doesn't need to get muscle glycogen?
Yeah, especially if you're in a fasted state when running. If it's staying the same or it's decreasing a little bit, that's most likely a sign that your body is using fat to fuel that exercise because you're not having to tap into glucose or create new glucose to fuel that. You know, you might have seen that little increase if you're doing something intense, but if you're really fat adapted, you might not even need to produce glucose to fuel that. Or if you're really trained and you're if you're in good shape, you might not need that extra energy for something that is higher intensity to somebody else. So it depends on where you're coming from and how much you've trained. But if it's staying steady, especially during running, it's most likely then a signal that you're utilizing fat as energy.
That's what I would think. But it's interesting, it went really low and then came back to levels. I don't know. So I know we're going to run out of time, but question on supplementation is people want to experiment. Like my blood sugar was higher than I thought it would be at nighttime, like 100. And so I was curious, okay, do I need some blood sugar support? I was trying that. Then I was testing out using ketone supplement that I have from Dr. Axe's company, Agent Nutrition. So I was testing that out. And then I, to keep doing this another couple of weeks because seeing how my blood sugar responds with menstrual cycle, and also I'm doing a detox program because I found out a mold toxicity with that organic acids test I just did. And so I'm trying to look at, okay, how is this all, trending and what impacts it? So have you tested people doing any ketone supplements with it? And if it's before bedtime to help stabilize while they're sleeping, their glucose levels?
Yeah, and we have had people use like ketone esters before they go to sleep or even during the day, and that does decrease glucose, but you are adding energy into the system. So it's not my favorite supplement to utilize as like a first line of defense. It will lower glucose, but that's only one piece of the picture, and it is adding extra energy to the system. And I think there are better supplements to utilize. And so the first one I like that has the most evidence and we've seen work very well is just Berberine. Berberine, it mimics the similar pathways as what metformin is doing, which is the most commonly prescribed oral medication for diabetes. And it seems to increase glucose uptake into the cell and improves insulin sensitivity. And it's very low risk. And so there doesn't seem to be any like negative side effects, except maybe a little GI distress, so taking it with meals. But Berberine works really well. standard dose is 500 milligrams twice a day with meals. That works really well. Chromium works really well. So supplementation varies in studies. We've seen it work from 200 to 1,000 micrograms. Chromium works well. Bitter melon works well. Cinnamon works well, which is really easy. You could even just like add a bunch of cinnamon to your food, but you can take cinnamon tablets as well. And then we want to look of like, are you potentially deficient in any nutrients? There are certain nutrients that if you're deficient, that's going to have worse glucose outcomes and glucose control. If you're not deficient and we supplement, it might not add any benefit. But a lot of these are common deficiencies. So the number one is vitamin D, which, you know, many people are deficient in, and that's going to have an effect on your glucose levels. So wanting to check vitamin D levels. Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. What about the research going on with the whole COVID? Low vitamin D levels with people that have the worst symptoms. And I was putting this all together today. It's like insulin resistance, obesity, low vitamin D, and hello, you just said it all. I mean, it's all connected.
It's all connected. Absolutely. Yeah. Vitamin D is very involved in our insulin signaling, but also our immune response. And so that's all super connected. And there's an absolute link between your metabolic health and level of insulin resistance and risk of getting COVID, but also the outcomes you're going to have. So that is absolutely well defined at this point. And vitamin D is a big one. And many people are vitamin D deficient. And if they are, they're not taking high enough doses or frequent enough supplementation to really bring it up into optimal ranges. So that's a big one. We definitely want to measure. Other potential deficiencies that can have an effect are zinc and magnesium. Those are two big ones that we want to pay attention to as well and supplement if needed.
Essential fatty acids too are important. I think I saw that on one of our email lists.
Yeah. Alpha lipoic acid especially has shown to have quite a benefit for some people. And just making sure you're getting the right index of, you know, omega-6 to 3. So we don't want too much omega-6 where it can be inflammatory. We want to make sure we're getting enough omega-3s. So paying attention to that is also really important, because anything that's driving some chronic inflammation is also going to have an effect on our glucose levels.
Yeah, for sure. So what are your favorite supplements you take for daily immune health building, boosting?
Yeah. And I'm always, you know, a food first kind of person. Supplements should supplement. And so I don't take a lot at this point. Definitely taking my vitamin D, taking magnesium, and I'm taking ashwagandha. So those are only 3 I take at this point in time, actually.
Yeah, food first. I think it's a big thing for people to remember to think about nutrition as medicine, and really what we always say in nutritional therapy, I always learn that the goal is to start with eating real food, nutrient-dense foods, and look at that first. And then we work on digestion and nutrient absorption. That's the key part, is being able to eat real food that balances your blood sugar, and eat food that properly chew it and be in the parasympathetic nervous state and be able to digest and then be able to break it down, absorb it in your gut is an important part as well. People forget about the rest of the process.
Yeah, if you're eating real food, eating whole nutrient dense food, but you're not absorbing any of it, then we've lost that whole benefit.
Yeah. So awesome. So thanks so much. I know we'll probably have a lot more questions coming in, and when people sign up for NutriSense, you get to join the Facebook group page. It's a private page we have, and have lots of questions back and forth. So I'll put the link to order the 14-day. And how does the program work? You get it, you can pick what program you want or how long you want to use it for.
Exactly. Yeah. So we have 2 different options. We have, you know, if you just want 1 CGM, you just want to do it for 14 days, we have that. There's no commitment, just a one-time fee. You get the CGM and the app and the dietitian. And then we also have monthly subscriptions if you want to do it for longer. You know, if you want to see your cycle, or you want to test different diets or supplements, those things take a little bit more than 14 days. So that's a great option if you have something to work on, or you want to experiment with different things. So we have different monthly options as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you need a month long or more, because as I've been experimenting with time of the month and my different exercise workouts and fasting and a detox program that I'm doing right now and a gut rebuilding program. So it's really kind of fun to see. But of course, noting what I can eat and what I can't eat, and really how to adjust. And if you have those carbs, it's carb timing. And it's perfect information. After my long run Sunday, I could have a little bit of carbs and it did nothing. So it really proves for athletes what we always talk about, that carb timing, that you can have some carbs. All carbs aren't evil, even though they're not essential or necessary, but sometimes you do want some. They can be placed in the right timing. So it's beneficial.
Right. There could certainly be a smarter way to include carbohydrates in your diet if you want to include them. Yeah. There are better ways to do it than others.
Yeah. I mean, and then it just kind of motivates me to eat more meat, because I do better, more carnivore, even though I don't really like a lot of meat. And I've learned that, you know, vegetables and other foods don't do as well for me, but it's N=1. You know, I look at the ancestry background, my DNA fit, and look at all this information, as well as food sensitivities, really dial in what does my body, my microbiome need to have for fuel come into my body to be healthy and be the best version of myself. So I can really dial in exactly what I need.
And I love that. And that's really our logo, is data over dogma. You know, do the experiments, test for yourself, have these different data points, try things, because at the end of the day, we are all so unique and so different. Anyone who works with people knows this. Like, there's not a general one size fits all at all. Like, I can't give you a one package that's going to work. It just doesn't happen that way.
That's why I don't really do as many group programs, because everyone's so different. I'm like, I can't tell everyone to eat the same thing because it's so different. And then I don't really know how to individualize a program unless I get all this individual data for people. So thanks so much. I will be including it into my coaching programs for sure. So I appreciate your information and putting up with all my questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to help.
Great. We'll put all the links in the show notes, and you can join in our NutriSense experiment, N=1.